She caught her breath sharply and closed her eyes. Then she turned and fled to the front porch and breathed deeply and windily of the heady September Wisconsin morning air. As she stood there, with her stiff, short black curls still damp and glistening, in her best shoes and stockings, with the all-enveloping apron covering her sturdy little figure, the light of struggle and renunciation in her face, she typified something at once fine and earthy. But the real struggle was to come later. They went to Temple at 10, Theodore with his beloved violin tucked carefully under his arm. Bella Weinberg was waiting at the steps. "Did you?" she asked eagerly. "Of course not," replied Fanny disdainfully. "Do you think I'd eat old breakfast when I said I was going to fast all day?" Then with sudden suspicion, "Did you?" "No," stoutly. Then they entered and took their seats. It was fascinating to watch the other members of the congregation come in, the women rustling, the men subdued in the unaccustomed dignity of black on a weekday. One glance at the yellow pews was like reading a complete social and financial register. The seating arrangement of the temple was the Almanach de Gotha of Congregation Emmanuel. Old Ben Reitman, patriarch among the Jewish settlers of Winnebago, who had come over in immigrant youth, and who now owned hundreds of rich farm acres, besides houses, mills, and banks, kinged it from the front seat of the center section. He was a magnificent old man, with a ruddy face, and a fine head with a shock of heavy iron gray hair, keen eyes, undimmed by years, and a startling and unexpected dimple in one cheek that gave him a mischievous and boyish look. Behind this dignitary sat his sons and their wives, and his daughters and their husbands, and their children, and so on, back to the Brandeis pew, third from the last, behind which sat only a few obscure families branded as Russians, as only the German-born Jew can brand those whose misfortune it is to be born in that region known as Hinter Berlin. The morning flew by, with its music, its responses, its sermon in German, full of 4- and 5-syllable German words like Barmherzigkeit and Eigentumlichkeit. All during the sermon Fanny sat and dreamed and watched the shadow on the window of the pine tree that stood close to the temple, and was vastly amused at the jaundiced look that the square of yellow window glass cast upon the face of the vain and overdressed Mrs. Nathan Perellis. From time to time Bella would turn to bestow upon her a look intended to convey intense suffering and a resolute though dying condition. Fanny stonily ignored these mute messages. They offended something in her, though she could not tell what. At the noon intermission she did not go home to the tempting dinner smells, but wandered off through the little city park and down to the river, where she sat on the bank and felt very virtuous and spiritual and hollow. She was back in her seat when the afternoon service was begun. Some of the more devout members had remained to pray all through the midday. The congregation came straggling in by twos and threes. Many of the women had exchanged the severely corseted discomfort of the morning splendor for the comparative ease of second-best silks. Mrs. Brandeis, absent from her business throughout this holy day, came hurrying in at 2 to look with a rather anxious eye upon her pale and resolute little daughter. The memorial service was to begin shortly after 3, and lasted almost 2 hours. At 2:45 Bella slipped out through the side aisle, beckoning mysteriously and alluringly to Fanny as she went. Fanny looked at her mother. "Run along," said Mrs. Brandeis. "The air will be good for you. Come back before the memorial service begins." Fanny and Bella met, giggling, in the vestibule. "Come on over to my house for a minute," Bella suggested. "I want to show you something." The Weinberg house, a great, comfortable, well-built home with encircling veranda and a well-cared-for lawn, was just a scant block away. They skipped across the street, down the block, and in at the back door. The big, sunny kitchen was deserted. The house seemed very quiet and hushed. Over it hung the delicious fragrance of freshly baked pastry. Bella, a rather baleful look in her eyes, led the way to the butler's pantry that was as large as the average kitchen. And there, ranged on platters and baking boards and on snowy white napkins, was that which made Tantalus's feast seem a dry and barren snack. The Weinbergs had baked. It is the custom in the household of Atonement Day fasters of the old school to begin the evening meal, after the 24 hours of abstainment, with coffee and freshly baked coffee cake of every variety. It was a lead pipe blow at one's digestion, but delicious beyond imagining. Bella's mother was a famous cook, and her 2 maids followed in the ways of their mistress. There were to be sisters and brothers and out-of-town relations as guests at the evening meal, and Mrs. Weinberg had outdone herself. "Oh!" exclaimed Fanny, in a sort of agony and delight. "Take some," said Bella the temptress. The pantry was fragrant as a garden with spices and fruit scents, and the melting, delectable perfume of brown, freshly baked dough, sugar coated. There was one giant platter devoted wholly to round, plump cakes, with puffy edges, in the center of each a sunken pool that was all plum, bearing on its bosom a snowy sifting of powdered sugar. There were others whose centers were apricot, pure molten gold in the sunlight. There were speckled expanses of cheese kuchen, the golden brown surface showing rich cracks through which one caught glimpses of the lemon yellow cheese beneath, cottage cheese that had been beaten up with eggs and spices and sugar and lemon. Flaky crust rose jaggedly above this plateau. There were cakes with jelly and cinnamon kuchen, and cunning cakes with almond slices nestling side by side. And there was freshly baked bread, twisted loaf, with poppy seed freckling its braid, and its sides glistening with the butter that had been liberally swabbed on it before it had been thrust into the oven. Fanny Brandeis gazed, hypnotized. As she gazed, Bella selected a plum tart and bit into it, bit generously, so that her white little teeth met in the very middle of the oozing red-brown juice, and one heard a little squirt as they closed on the luscious fruit. At the sound Fanny quivered all through her plump and starved little body. "Have one," said Bella generously. "Go on. Nobody'll ever know. Anyway, we've fasted long enough for our age. I could fast till supper time if I wanted to, but I don't want to." She swallowed the last morsel of the plum tart and selected another, apricot this time, and opened her moist red lips. But just before she bit into it (the Inquisition could have used Bella's talents) she selected its counterpart and held it out to Fanny. Fanny shook her head slightly. Her hand came up involuntarily. Her eyes were fastened on Bella's face. "Go on," urged Bella. "Take it. They're grand. Mmm." The first bite of apricot vanished between her rows of sharp white teeth. Fanny shut her eyes as if in pain. She was fighting the great fight of her life. She was to meet other temptations, and perhaps more glittering ones, in her lifetime, but to her dying day she never forgot that first battle between the flesh and the spirit, there in the sugar-scented pantry, and the spirit won. As Bella's lips closed upon the second bite of apricot tart, the while her eye roved over the almond cakes and her hand still held the sweet out to Fanny, that young lady turned sharply, like a soldier, and marched blindly out of the house, down the back steps, across the street, and so into the temple. The evening lights had just been turned on. The little congregation, relaxed, weary, weak from hunger, many of them, sat rapt and still except at those times when the prayer book demanded spoken responses. The voice of the little rabbi, rather weak now, had in it a timbre that made it startlingly sweet and clear and resonant. Fanny slid very quietly into the seat beside Mrs. Brandeis, and slipped her moist and cold little hand into her mother's warm, work-roughened palm. The mother's brown eyes, very bright with unshed tears, left their perusal of the prayer book to dwell upon the white little face that was smiling rather wanly up at her. The pages of the prayer book lay 2/3 or more to the left. Just as Fanny remarked this, there was a little moment of hush in the march of the day's long service. The memorial hour had begun. Little Doctor Thalmann cleared his throat. The congregation stirred a bit, changed its cramped position. Bella, the guilty, came stealing in, a pink and gold picture of angelic virtue. Fanny, looking at her, felt very aloof and clean and remote. Molly Brandeis seemed to sense what had happened. "But you didn't, did you?" she whispered softly. Fanny shook her head. Rabbi Thalmann was seated in his great carved chair. His eyes were closed. The wheezy little organ in the choir loft at the rear of the temple began the opening bars of Schumann's Traumerei. And then, above the cracked voice of the organ, rose the clear, poignant wail of a violin. Theodore Brandeis had begun to play. You know the playing of the average boy of 15, that nerve-destroying, uninspired scraping. There was nothing of this in the sounds that this boy called forth from the little wooden box and the stick with its taut lines of catgut. Whatever it was, the length of the thin, sensitive fingers, the turn of the wrist, the articulation of the forearm, the something in the brain, or all these combined, Theodore Brandeis possessed that which makes for greatness. You realize that as he crouched over his violin to get his cello tones. As he played today the little congregation sat very still, and each was thinking of his ambitions and his failures, of the lover lost, of the duty left undone, of the hope deferred, of the wrong that was never righted.